So yeah, nothing particularly different except for the big difference in participating and attending here is really your going to be your ability and preparedness to really answer the questions as you see them pop up and know that we talked about it and you have a chance to answer questions. So what's going to happen, and I'll repeat this again before we finish up today, what's going to happen on Wednesday is that we have to start the next unit this week. I can't just have you test out and then wait until the following week, right? Because each week is 2 weeks. And the next unit coming up, which is genetics, heredity, and speciation, is way more complicated than what we've been looking at now. So especially you all that are here right in the beginning, and you've got some note-taking stuff present, and you're keeping Canvas open so you can follow along with some of the things in the textbook as well. And I'll give you some page numbers as we go along this morning as well for you to find these things. It's going to make a huge difference. Now, and there's another thing going on. I know that some of my students here that just added within the last couple of days, this first exam is only worth 25 points. Your quiz was worth 10 points. And so we just had 35 required points at this point. After this unit, because we've had a little bit of time, a week and a half to get settled and figure out what, what your time schedule is going to be and that sort of thing, then the units are worth more points. So participation and actually being here is gonna make this go much more smoothly for you as we go through. So, okay, so this morning, a couple of things here to backwards look at, and I'm gonna go ahead and pull up, but again, unmute and ask questions. If I am on screen share, I can't see the chat area. I will eventually be able to later, but if you don't like talking in the chat, if someone else would read what the chat says so I can hear it and I can either slow down or answer or tell you, oh, that's interesting, but I can tell you ahead of time that I won't test you on that. And that's, I think, also fair too. If you're looking at something, probably nothing in this first couple chapters, but once we get to things that are more techie and involved, if you have a question that's real specific, like, is this testable? Go ahead and ask it. If it is, I will be honest and say, yes, I intend to put that in the mix, or no, that's not something that this course has to really focus on. You won't see it in point type questions as we go. Okay, so I am going to open up a presentation here on mine, and it'll just be a quick warm-up, wrap-up of what we were doing up until now, because it still matters. The reason all those individuals that are mentioned, from John Ray through Charles Darwin, including the early geology people and so forth, the reason they're all in there is because whether they knew it or not, they were participating in what we recognize as science and the scientific method today. So let's look at a couple more things that are going to help for the whole rest of the course. So we switch over and then go on to taking a look at some of the other, welcome Nicole, some of the other things that are going on. All right, so, oops, pushing buttons. I have the Monday morning thing going on. Okay, so this is just a conclusion. A conclusion part to our lesson. So we did talk about this last week, but again, I do recognize that we have some people that are adding, so I want to make sure that they have a chance to catch up. Again, if really what we do in the class, if we don't stop and spend some time thinking about how this relates to the world that you're participating in right now. I could say living, but it's really more participation, isn't it? As a consumer, as an employee, as a parent, child, member of a family, larger community, and so forth. If we don't link these things to really what's actually going on with you, then the chances that you will remember things particularly well is not quite as clear. So the general public Again, remember from last time, last couple of times, the general public has a little bit been misled by how we use the output of science, right? Production of procedures, or the creation of remedies, or the using general things that we know about the environment in order to solve issues in manufacturing and so forth. So really, actually, though, technically science just collects observation on the natural world that we can test, right? That someone else can go back and go through the steps, collect data, repeat the experiment, and verify or falsify. So remember all the time from your first bit of 2 and our conversations previously, falsifiable pops up all the time. It has to be something that someone else can go after and then find that, oh yeah, you were correct, or I found one little thing slightly different, or where they're saying, no, no one else could recreate this. We need to go back and think about it again. So here's another one that down here towards the bottom in bold. Best possible current explanation. I think as a member of society with lots and lots of friends that don't do jobs that have anything to do with science whatsoever, that sometimes one of the things they don't seem to like about reading about discoveries or keeping up with health or nutrition news or physiology or things like what's going on with the global reproduction and so forth, is that the conclusions change or the recommendations may change. But since really what we're doing is understanding what's going on in nature based on what data we have and how we can collect it, then really, particularly, and you know, again, we're right in the middle of something that's going to be historically extremely significant while we're doing it and after we're through it, that every day we've got our best possible current explanation, the most that we know. Remember when it first started off, they were saying, well, it didn't look like this was going to be COVID-19, looked like it was probably really only something we were worried about if you were probably well over age 60. And now we see that lots of people, depending on some other kinds of things like where you work or general healthiness issues may come into account. And we can see also that it does have general physiological impact even on very young children in some cases. So that changed. Recently, and again, we'll come back to it in the end of the course, I'm looking at some big global data that says that you have a slightly larger chance of contracting the disease, knowing you have it and being quite sick, depending on your blood type. That there's no blood type that is immune, but there is one blood type that seems to be, no matter whether the people, and again, this is how you know it's real science. The data from China says the same thing. The data from Europe says the same thing. The US data is saying the same thing, that some blood types have a slightly higher incidence of real problems with this particular disease. So we're always at the best possible current explanation. It used to be, right, here's an example that's a different one, where that you've probably seen this either in memes or fun stuff on the internet, where remedies for stress, exhaustion, postpartum depression, aging, aches and pains, where you would buy these tonics, and they were highly recommended by doctors who went to medical school in the day. And they contained a whole lot of interesting things, which are basically essentially cocaine. And yeah, you did feel stimulated. Now we know that's not the best way to treat those. So best possible current explanation. But the part that I think is the most exciting always for students just beginning to study these things and think about profession and employment and so forth, is that means you're always needed, that the new lab results are always needed, that new perspectives are always going to be needed. Okay, so we're never really done. So it means that we aren't really looking for capital T truth. Capital T truth goes back to really things that personally we hold emotionally, behaviorally, and socially to the heart, right? To the core of how we want to conduct our existence, really. Science isn't looking for that because we're never at the dead end. It's really compiling empirical evidence or observation about the natural world. And that's what we use FACT for. So if you see any questions, for those of you, I did send a reminder out on quizzing. If you hadn't started or completed your quizzing, you have until the end of day today to do that. And then, or on Wednesday when you do exam, that the answers here, fact always within science has to be observations that are going to be measurable. We got to get ratios, or we have to get persistence, or we have to get some other type of measurable evaluation. And so really responsible scientists, if they're really being fair and we're not becoming too much egomaniacs, we need to really be clear that our conclusions are never really final. Now, one of the things that we looked at, and I would like you to speak up for just a couple seconds here. Here we go, Davion. For this one, that we're never at the end result is something that we mentioned right from the very beginning as part of your definition of empirical. So if you look back in your notes, you should see right away what one of the things that's going on with this. So you all, why is it that we would really never say that we are never really a final conclusion to understanding nature, especially not right now?
Probably because there's always something more you could find out about it.
Yes, Jacob, you are 3/4 the way to like super duper perfection on that one. Anyone want to add? Yes, we're always moving towards. Go ahead, Lisette.
Because science is always changing.
Yes, and why is it always changing? What data collection did we start out with 10,000 years ago, right? Just natural census. What do we have now?
Technology.
Yeah, perfect, Diego, perfect. Yeah, all these new things that we invent are getting more sensitive about how we pick up anything from wavelengths of energy, light, sound, and so forth, to even beginning to understand even the electromagnetic biology of your brain. Anybody who studies the brain can tell you we don't understand very much about it at all. That's why there's almost every single week some new little thing that they post about, oh, your memory might have something to do with being able to access fatty molecules in your brain, or that your brain can make new pathways, or right. So as we develop new equipment, and a lot of it is developed for those of you that like animals more than you love thinking about humans, as we develop a lot more of this new equipment, we really can see that when we look at other organisms and see how they respond or what they're able to do, it begins to show us really clearly that we can't actually, we're not as aware, for instance, of day length or electromagnetic factors or biochemical things, and particularly not odor. Humans and primates in general don't have a very good way to collect odor molecules, right? So yeah, we're not final because we're always going to be somebody who's curious and is going to try it again. We are always looking to identify things that we didn't really notice were going to be important, and then also we're inventing the equipment constantly that we can use to pick that up. So perfect. All right. So yeah, right. New tests can always be designed, or at least just in all of human experience so far, that are going to reveal new information. All right, and our last one, again, to make it balanced for you as a person, as a human being, that balance, humanness is not only recognizing that your brain collects empirical evidence all day, every day. Even when we're sleeping, you're still monitoring, right, temperature, sounds, odors, things like that as we go. But that was happening also even in the fetal condition, even when you were still in the uterus. So we always are acting that way, but many things about our human experience, like creativity, emotional stances, our reaction to things personally, what we remember about our dreams, and how we feel about the death state and things like that, those are not scientific experiences, and we need to explore those either personally or in groups or in really large groups, which are social. So there's lots of things that science, right? Those would be experiences that we have that can't be measured using our senses or technology yet. And for lots of us, we probably don't even really want our senses and technology to manage some of those other kinds of things. I think it's very cool. Maybe you do too, when people say, I keep a recorder right by where I sleep because I'm a musician or a writer or a poet or a dancer, and I wake up in the middle of the night and I'm like, wow, I got to jot this down as fast as possible. It just came to me, and then I go right back to sleep. And yeah, I've read or watched many, many interviews with creative people where they're like, yeah, all the lyrics to this, I just woke up and wrote it all down. Or right when I first woke up in the morning, it was right there, even though I've been wondering about it for a while. So some of you might even write your papers that way, rather than writing it down and then fixing it 10,000 times. You might just have it cooking and percolating in your mental state, and then one day put it down and it's mostly the way that you wanted it to be. Okay, so humans are both. That's our big thing here. All right, probably no questions about this part because it's just a wrap up from what we did before. So now let's skip a few lines or go over to another page for things, and let's talk about that inventory of folks there in the beginning of chapter 2. Let me make this one on my screen. Go away. And I'm going to find something else that we can pull up for this one. Oops. Hello, please stop being so picky. All right, so, okay. No problem with all of that. All right, so let's talk about what's going on with the history part of chapter 2, and some of you probably already noticed it, but in this particular case, the conversation is certainly not global. It certainly isn't something that would be of equal import to the entire planet. So why not? Why socially and historically isn't what's in the beginnings of the second part that we did in chapter 2, Origins of Evolutionary Thought? It makes it sound like, that this is the only place in the world where people accept change over time, and that is certainly not accurate for human societies. But it does, it really is focusing just on things that would be significant to individuals that are coming to the now within the group that you're currently participating within, which is a Western society viewpoint. So another way to think about chapter 2 is, in the history report, is how did, in Europe and certain margins of the Mediterranean, how did they go from thousands of years of a society where thinking about change in the natural world was actually illegal? It becomes not something most people are thinking about, and then right about, here we go, and then right about the last few centuries between the BC AD move over, it literally becomes something where it is contrary to political authority, and the punishments for everything from execution to torture to being kicked out of communities or regions or taking all of your wealth or belongings or so forth, to coming back around to admitting that your natural senses, even if you didn't use any other form of instrumentation, we're showing you every day that the natural environment changes, that change is a natural part of how this planet actually works. And then the last part is, once we get through the acceptance of change as a phenomenon, then how do we explain how that natural fact or phenomena works? So from last time, just in case, I'm just going to put this back. Let me go back. Put them all here. I did suggest that you put your notes in for chapter 2 in these 4 little quadrants. The nature of science, that's what we worked on when we started with what's empirical data, what does reliable mean in science, why does it have to be falsifiable, what is the goal of it, is just to explain. And then the activity of science. Your textbook has a little bit more on the activity. When we finished up on Wednesday, you have a couple little notes that compare, contrast induction versus deduction, induction versus deduction. And then also, just as a reminder, in case that you didn't notice, I am going to use discussion board 2. You all please use the discussion board if you have a question about how is something working in class, or when is something due, or something else like that. Or you can also just post things that are of general interest. I'm going to use it to keep you all kind of together and kind of think ahead of time what questions might be. And then also, because streaming videos via Zoom does not seem to work particularly awesome, at least last week it wasn't, I went ahead and posted a short 7-minute streaming video that really looks at this, and it has definitions for fact, hypothesis, theory, and law, and it's in the discussion board, and you can all find it. You don't have to watch it within there. It goes over to YouTube, but it's in there for you. So rather than crowding up the module with more and more and more pages to go through. So that one's there from last time as well. So we've wrapped up that. We just did a few conclusions. Now, today, reestablishing the recognition of evolution, again, change over time, as a fact, as a natural fact in the Western world. That I would keep my notes for Wednesday separate, and then skip a couple lines, and then move over to explaining how organic evolution occurs. Now, an explanation links to this vocabulary term for us for the entire course, which is theory. Theory, remember, is our strongest data supported and repeated testing, observation, and attempts to take it apart statement. A theory is far stronger a statement than a hypothesis. A theory comes at the end of experimentation. Hypothesis is your first thoughts before you start the experiment. So theory is based on deduction, the end. Okay, so that's what, how that's structured there in the chapter. I'll do this type of suggestions for you through chapter, especially 3 when it comes up, because we're going to start genetics as of Wednesday. And then after that, I'm pretty sure you'll know how to look for that, and you'll know that that's a good way to organize your thoughts and your prep notes for this. All right, so let's look at science, right? Before we look at those historic people, why are they all in there? Whether they're saying that it's John Ray and Linnaeus, and actually we renamed him, his name wasn't Linnaeus, it was Carl von Linné, through Buffon, Cuvier, Hutton, Lyell, those individuals, what they all have in common, no matter what they thought their project was, no matter what they were personally interested in studying, no matter whether they believed that the planet changed over time or not, all of them were observing the phenomena And then they were collecting data. All of them were collecting data on something that was natural. Their own conclusion really, as you go through it one last time, didn't really matter. What they did was collect data and then they published it, they shared it so that someone else could see that data. And that's how science really ideally will work, that we share what we have learned. So they formulated a hypothesis, which is just their starting explanation, their tentative explanation, and then they tested it. They collected thousands of skeletons of organisms. They collected thousands of drawings or pieces of fossils. They collected tons of measurements from looking at erosion, whatever it was that they were looking at through that particular group of individuals in that. Again, the pages start on 16 and just go through to the top of 18. It's really, really quick. Saint-Hilaire is in there and so forth. So they were working through that, and then they either accepted, rejected, or refined the hypothesis. And that's what science always does, your starting idea. For those of you that are like, oh, I really don't want to study science in this much detail, just remember, again, relating this to your everyday life, every time you go into the kitchen and you make anything to eat that has more than one thing that you're adding together, if you're smushing it, heating it, working with it in any way, if you're adding multiple levels of certain things, whether it's a pancake or some really more time-intensive sauce or something like that, you are actually conducting an experiment. You are taking the ingredients you think will lead you to what it is you're hoping to end up with, and then you're finding out whether you were correct or whether it worked that way. And sometimes we try it slightly differently. Like those of you that like cooking meat, you probably all know that if your meat is cold when you start cooking it, you're never going to get it as perfect as you might want it, as if your meat is room temperature before you start cooking it, especially red meat on the grill or for fast cooking. If it starts out cold, it's going to be dry, or it's going to be harder, or it's going to take too long and you're going to lose moisture. If it starts out room temperature, lots of you are like, yep, that's exactly why my stuff is awesome when I cook on red meat. Some of you are vegetarian or vegan, and you're like, oh, that didn't really matter. But yeah, even if you're adding several things together, even if it's all veggies. So you're doing a scientific experiment. All right, so inquiry, again, scientific method, we state a hypothesis, we collect it, and then we support or refute it. So here's a question, you all, and I would like you all to think about this for a second. And I can't see the chat box, so just unmute and speak up if you would like to, because I'm sure we all need to be able to do this. But again, thinking about this and being able to answer it and then jotting this down just for at least a portion of it this morning is going to help you answer certain questions when we get to Wednesday. If we are doing an experiment and you're trying to discover something new, whether it's food related or something else, and your hypothesis was, well, I understand something about this. I'm going to try and see if these are the things that relate to the end product. If you get to the end and your original idea was not supported, it turns out it doesn't work the way that it seemed like it was going to work, is that what we would label a failure as an experiment? Is that experiment actually a failure within science? Not to you as an emotional human being, but within science.
I would say no, because you answered the question that it doesn't work, and you can go on to figuring out what does work.
Yes, perfect. This happened a lot when I was not so much in, the first 4 years of college, but I had to spend a lot of time in graduate school. I didn't have to, I wanted to, honestly. I wasn't good at much when I was those years, but I really enjoyed learning new stuff and being challenged in that particular way. But frequently it would happen that I had friends that spent months or sometimes years working on projects because it was going to be their master's write-up or their doctoral dissertation, and they would get to the end and say, I looked at it in every possible way and it doesn't work, and they would just be emotionally flattened, devastated, like, you know, just choking up or not sleeping, and they're like, I don't know what I'm going to do. And right, so sometimes we work on something for so long, especially in academics, we forget what the real purpose of the whole program was for you to try this out, for you to experience this. And the truth was, as long as, just as you just mentioned, as long as you collected all the data of all your steps and you shared it with everyone else so that who was interested, so that they could see why it didn't work, then you have actually improved and saved other people time. They can start a slightly different study, or they can look at it with a slightly different set of influences or something like that. So yes, as long as you collect data, the data is measurable, and you share that data and you let other people see what's going on, you have had a successful process. Well, that's nice, right? Is this beginning to make it more clear how just doing something scientifically is way different than, let's say, for instance, having a lab investigation job for a company that needs to market a product, right? Because if you're doing this way just to learn things, then those companies aren't that supportive of those employees because they need to make money off of what you're doing. And so that idea for the general public that if it doesn't work out, you're a failure, it's a failure, is opposite of what we're really trying to take a look at here. So yes, especially once we add capitalist society to this conversation, it becomes a little more murky. But generally in pure science, you've learned something as long as you save it. So again, one last time, we start from just being in the natural world, our observations. You make a hypothesis, which is you know something, so it's not a guess, but it is a weaker statement. That type of thinking is induction. Then you go with data collection. We can call it experiment. It can be collecting responses. It can be however you want. Like I'm guessing that probably some of you, every time now I want to buy something that is a little bit more expensive, or that I'm going to know that I want to use for a prolonged period of time, I always try to look over at a website from groups like Consumer Reports, where they do lab experiments on, is that pan really going to last a long time? Or they say that it doesn't make any toxic fumes. Is that really what happened? Or what vehicle lasts the longest with the fewest expensive repairs and that kind of stuff. So I like doing that. I think generally consumers like doing it too. And then at the end, once you've done this and you repeat this first 3-part cycle over and over and over again, you're finally able to say with lots of repeated verified data that you're going to be at the end, you have a deduction, and that deduction may produce a theory, right? An explanation of natural phenomenon of how or why something actually occurs. So let's move then about these individuals. So again, they were looking at natural data, they were publishing their data, all of them. They didn't all get to the same deduction, but they aren't considered failures because we were able to see what they collected. And in their own generations, for about a 300-year period that this data was accumulating and accumulating. Okay, so Western thought, this is just for the part of the world that would be more or less what you consider today geopolitically the Middle East, Eastern, Western, and Northern Europe. This is not Native American thought. This is not Far Eastern thought. This is not for indigenous societies elsewhere in Africa. Because in those parts of the world, people never got into an overtly political or punishment type situation where you weren't allowed to talk about how the world was changing over time. Change was accepted as the normal part of it. So what happened in this particular period of the world to get to this situation where they did not believe that the world would change. So your textbook starts with the ancient Greeks and calls out, most all the textbooks do, whether it's Gen Bio or BioAnth or any of these, calls out a influential Greek thinker and writer who's known today as Aristotle. And there are a couple on this at the bottom. There are a couple of terms here that you want to take a look at. Here, I'm going to just pull up this. I'm not using it necessarily. We'll do the this one right here. So this one, immutability of species, be sure that you jot that one down. And great chain of being, be sure that you jot this one down. So these two down here. Now, Greek culture begins really to collect written records or documents a couple thousand years BC. Writing is invented earlier than that in the Middle East, but they begin to write enough and then store it enough or recopy it enough so that we actually have some surviving texts. There were probably tons of writers who were really interesting from the period, but we don't have their data surviving. So luckily there is a fairly good body of at least recording what people in the interim wrote about Aristotle. Interestingly enough about Aristotle and some of his co-workers in ancient Greek society is they did say that from their observations that all life had originated in the ocean. And it's true. It's natural fact, it's empirical fact as far as all the data that we have so far. Now, their amount of data for doing this was really, really interesting. They noticed that blood and tears had a level of saltiness that was quite similar to ocean water, not fresh water. And they believed that that combination of those liquids would have had to originate in that particular environment, which is really, really interesting. But they did believe that once everything had been created, then it stopped changing. So this term, you all, in case you didn't already know it, mute, like mutation, M-U-T is the core word here. So im is a prefix for not in science, so immutable. So they said once all the species that were going to emerge from the water did, and once those plants that got in soil were there and established, once the things in the Mediterranean or the ocean, fishes and other kinds of critters and plants and so forth, once they were all established, then it all stopped, that you got to a starting plant and nothing had changed since then. So beginning a couple thousand years BC, this concept of immutability is well established within this environment or this place in the planet. So immutability. Are there still some people in our modern society that believe that evolution does not occur for living things? And the answer is yes, there are some usually faith-based groups that still personally hold that things are not evolving, that we will not see new species appear or new variants of a species appear in the future, that that's not how it was set up to be. Now, great chain of being, this is another one. Great chain of being, then, right, when we do classification, and again, socially, and this is a giant and really overdue conversation, not just for the society that we're in at this particular moment, but the entire planet, as far as I can see, whether historically or looking at modern news. But then everything was classified in a ranked system. The great chain of being is about ranking, you all. So in this case, what they're saying is that they believe that organisms, some of them are simple and not that important, and that there's a sort of a medium group where there's something about them that gives them qualities that are more valuable or more meaningful. And then there are some that get closer or are at the very top where that's actually the A+. That was the species or the organism, that was the real goal of creation to begin with. So you all At the top of the great chain of being, what species is always in Western thought the top of the great chain of being? Which organism is it?
Humans?
Yep. Always. For all of them. It doesn't really matter even what country, what religion, what political group. They're always saying that humans were always the goal of this somewhat magical or supernatural form of spontaneous creation, and that everything else are just kind of starting versions, and that it got better and better and better. Regardless of whether they thought this took a long time to happen or whether they thought it took 1 week to happen, that humans would be on the top of this. We still, even though you personally probably, like many of your friends, neighbors, and cohorts in modern society, do value the natural environment or the contribution of other organisms in the environment, we still all the time have this blind spot where we're still operating within the great chain of being. Sometimes it's really clearly racist and saying even within humans, we have some that are the superior body model and some that are not the superior body model. Again, scientifically not supported in any particular way or in any even minor way. There's no, it's just made up. It's just part of personality and other kinds of considerations. But if you've ever heard a news report, for instance, during fire season, where they say there's a fire, it's consumed 5,000 acres, but luckily there's been no loss of life. That conclusion, no loss of life, if it's burned 5,000 acres, right, it's killed a huge amount of molds, fungus, microorganisms, insects, plants, mammals, egg-laying things, and so forth, that clearly there's a tremendous loss of life. They're just saying that only humans matter. And so I hear this all the time in local news, constantly, every year, my entire life. And it was not, yeah, I wasn't a kid when I first started to notice that, oh gosh, they just don't really care. Or the other ones where you'll see people and it'll be a local news story saying, we have to do something, the county has to do something, or the city has to do something because we're walking our dogs in the morning and we saw a coyote, or we saw a bobcat, or there it was a wolf, or we think it was a puma, or whatever it is. That's saying that those other organisms shouldn't be allowed to be anywhere near us because they don't have an important spot. So that, again, those, whether even it's supposed to be legal or so forth, those are really great chain of being kinds of concepts for us. And so, yeah, we're still in it. We have not shaken off the great chain of being. But here's the thing to think about, perhaps, and then we'll move forward off of this one. If we're saying that there's a winner or a superiority contest in organisms, then you need to always say, just the same as any other type of contest or any other type of way of looking at nature or the world, we need to say, what was the contest about? If it's the biggest inventory of variety within that type, humans don't win. We are the only hominins left right now. We are the only biped, I'm using vocabulary words, right, that you're gonna need for the quiz and for the exam. You're the only hominin left. So we're the only bipedal mammal on the planet. So yeah, if you're saying we're unique, I guess there would be that one. If you're saying that the oldest organisms that started at the beginning of time and have lasted all the way to the now, that's microorganisms. We're not even close. Our particular group doesn't even, the ancestors that aren't even bipeds, they only start maybe, oh gosh, less than 40 million years ago. And when they're bipeds, it only really starts about 7 million years ago. So we're very, very recent. If it's the biggest or the most, and in fact, most everything about us is not particularly unique. The really one thing that is unique about you is that you're a bipedal mammal. So that is a contest that we win. We are bipedal. for that one. But yeah, we're not the most numerous. We can't survive in all kinds of things. Even when humans say, oh, geez, we could, if we use these things, or we do this type of pollution, or we drop these bombs, we can wipe out all life on Earth. Actually, scientific studies have shown that we cannot wipe out all life on Earth. We just wipe out life that's like us. So, which we don't want to do. I'm not joking about that, but we can't destroy everything because there are things that even can withstand us. So great gene of being, really, really old, still around, and still rearing its head in an odd way of thinking about nature. So we don't, so I'm going to go back on this one. I'm just going to leave this here for the second because it goes on for a really long period of time. So what goes on beginning about 81 all the way through to about 1300 here? What happens is, and you'll get some of this, or you have already gotten it in K-12 or your college history classes or your personal explorations of media or reading, is historically in this part of the world, what we see is the Greek making a small area where they first start and kind of extending influence. That passes over to the Roman Empire where they take over, not everything about day-to-day life, but they take over economies, they take over trade routes, they take over movement of populations, they subjugate, they retrain, they pass along their ideas to things. And at the fall of the Roman Empire, we have yet another group that emerges out of the Eastern Mediterranean area, which comes together and forms the Roman Catholic Church. This is not saying that that is a bad institution in every way. This is just saying that at the beginning of this time, the Roman Catholic Church just has one big legal volume of everything that matters and everything that exists, and that's called the Bible. And the Bible certainly wasn't originally put together as an exploration of the natural world. So there are a couple sections in the Old Testament that just say, oh, how did we get to where we are now? And they're really brief, really, really brief answers to this. And it just says there is a divine or supernatural creator that created things in perfection. It put together the whole bit of everything that we can see. And when that creator was done, they were done. They made everything the way that they wanted it to be made, and then it was set. So that becomes basically their constitution and their encyclopedia and so forth. And so essentially the authorities say, this is it, and you have to follow it because we are the legal authority for everything. So if you don't follow this, if you're questioning whether this document is valid, accurate, important, legal, then you're a danger to our survival. And so we're going to execute you, or we're going to torture you until you see the light and recant, or we're going to kick you out, or we're going to take all your wealth, or other sorts of things. But here's the other thing. They really, even if it was a legal standard, the Catholic Church and then the subsidiary kingdoms and so forth that flow out from that, they really didn't have to really pull that into play very often, as far as we can tell from documents, because people during that particular period of time had so much more to worry about. There are plagues, there are invasions, there are climatic disasters, there are famines, there are changes in life. Really living on the day-to-day, trying to keep yourself and your family alive, try to get out of the way of an invading group, trying not to get sucked into territorial wars from royal elites, right? All that sort of thing. They were really concerned with the day-to-day in their own neighborhood. Remember, the biggest thing that changes with the development of science in the Western world is really that period of time where things stabilize a little bit more and people begin to travel further and further. And then eventually, usually years later, which is also another fascinating thing from history classes, eventually come back and say, you know, the equivalent of, oh my God, you have no idea what exists on the coast of Africa or in Asia or further eastern in Persia or in Siberia, or eventually getting to discover that there's huge other continental system that's across the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean. So in the Renaissance, people begin to have more data streams coming in saying, just because you know what's going on here does not mean that it's going on over there. And what else was happening? Whether they intended to or not, these people are coming home with what they thought were usually curiosities, drawings, animal skins, smashed up plants in paper. They were coming home with animals and people in cages. They were bringing home people that they had captured from the Pacific, from the Americas, from Asia, from all over Africa, and then saying, look, you know, it's very similar to us, but it's not exactly the same. Of course, in Western thought, because this is part of our very, very overdue conversation right now, because they were happy with themselves and comfortable with their own culture, anything that varied was not as good, right? Not as good as what they already had, or not as good as who they saw themselves to be. This seems to be humanity in general when we discover new variants of our life ways. But the question starts then, what really is out there? So when people are just collecting explanations or making the drawings or collecting things for museums, even if they just think it's curiosities, it's starting that scientific data collection inquiry. So, and then they begin to also be more interested in Greek and Roman literature again, and pick up or re-pick up immutability and that great chain of being, even if they hadn't had taken a look at it. So this becomes so set in stone, this idea that things had never changed, and that the only thing that might explain variability was degeneration or degradation. Again, all of these are very ugly antecedents to all of the very ugly behaviors that we see around the world today, where it's okay to kill anyone who doesn't look like you. It's okay to kill anyone who doesn't have the same religion. It's okay to wipe out small populations, because after all, your big group really needs those natural resources that those people live near. Yeah, we've been doing this for thousands of years, and it's coming to a head, hopefully with some bigger structural changes that we've seen before. So this gets to a particular period of time where in Western thought, right, centered around Judaism and Christianity primarily, but the Muslim faith also, right, has a territorial ancestry that's very, very close. And so there's lots of things that are very similar in regards to this, that finally in the 1500s, right around end of 1500s, the beginning of 1600s, officials within the Catholic Church have this idea that if there's something that in the Old Testament says in the beginning, and then it goes on and says a lot of genealogies for families and people and how long they lived and who their children were, and it leads up to events that were historically recorded and accurate, for that it should be possible to figure out by working backwards what calendar day in the beginning was. So somebody that pops up all the time is an individual who was an archbishop in the Irish grouping of the Catholic Church, who's Archbishop Usher. U-S-S-H-E-R, U-S-S-H-E-R, Archbishop Usher. Again, I'm spelling it, and I'll chat it in chat when we come back to it. So Archbishop Usher, in the early 1600s, uses all this and says, okay, I finally figured it out. The world was created in 4004 BC. And then they actually go ahead and print that in a footnote of Bibles, printed Bibles, for a very prolonged period of time after that. So if you were a churchgoer and you didn't dare not go to church in these areas, you had to show up. You probably wanted to because it was part of your day off, and then you saw friends, neighbors, or somebody that you might be hoping to be engaged to, or something else going on. It was really, you just did it. It wasn't really a choice like it is for us today in some parts of the world. So when they would read the beginning and it said in the beginning, then it would say 4004 BC. Now, there were also, 4004 BC is a nice rounded off number. And that means that if you accept that you believe that the planet is only approximately 6,000 years old. That's the total amount of time that everything that we can find that is still with us or not with us has been around. There are still people in the United States today that believe that the planet is only 6,000 years old. But you all, I know some of you already do. Does anybody already know how old the planet actually is empirically or from science data? Anybody? Do you know? How old is planet Earth?
13 billion years?
Okay, billion is the right bottom line. So the planet Earth is billions with the B, 4.5 billion years old, to the best data that we can get from every form of science. The sun and the rest of the system, so the sun coalesces and then starts pulling in other debris that coalesces and forms these planetary things that are phasing along. I'm gonna make this go back because I want to get out of my ears. Now we want to go, and I don't think I need to do this. I want to get back in. So the solar system is about 5 billion years old. So planet Earth, 4 billion, 4.5 billion, the solar system about 5 billion years old. So 6,000 years ago, you all, just as an example, 6,000 years ago would be 4000 BC. And in 4000 BC, just huge amounts of other things were already really, by 4004 BC, we already have domesticated plants and animals, giant farms going on. People had already begun to build their and were finished with these gargantuan stone structures all over the planet. I mean, it's really way, and they're just about to invent writing by then. So 4,000 or 6,000 year old is not very old. Now, Usher's 4004 BC stimulated work of a second cleric within the British system, whose name was Lightfoot, Lightfoot. Lightfoot said, oh yeah, you know what, you didn't finish this. We need to know the day and the hour. When was the world really blinked into existence? So since this was the Catholic Church, I bet you're not surprised that Lightfoot's summary was that the world blinked into existence on a Sunday. Of course it did, right? That's their day where everything is the most sacred and the most complete. However, Lightfoot, this one I'm not really clear on what data he used or what he said his data was. He said that the beginning of the world was October 23rd on a Sunday, which was a Sunday, October 23rd, 4004 BC, and that everything was created by nightfall, that it all came into there. So here you go. This is very interesting because already by the 1600s, the Catholic Church had already been celebrating the first day of the year as, right, January 1st. That the birth of Christ and then the revelation that he was present and all the people was right there in the beginning of January. So they'd already introduced changes into their system, but these things were actually published and they were just taken as fact, and then everybody else was really, really busy. So you add from the Renaissance and the new period, beginnings of the study of human anatomy and anatomy in general. So again, looking at bones and comparing those bone sequences from other animals, from animals that people are bringing back from adventures and so forth, is giving them a big data set of comparison. And again, going around the planet and looking at these new places and bringing things home. Now, those early scientists, the ones from John Ray, Linnaeus, who are some of the other names that are in there, Buffon, Cuvier, Saint-Hilaire, through those, they just give you a few, Sutton, Hutton, Lyell. They were really all pretty much just called naturalists. They were looking at nature. And so they aren't really separated in their own time. But for you in bright green here, please note that two of those individuals there, and it'll make it a little bit easier for you to remember and answer a question really, really simple in just a couple seconds and know that you're correct and move on. Inorganic world. Those are the people that form the beginnings of what we call today geology and geography. Those are Hutton and Lyell. And their theory statement as presented and still used today is called uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism is a theory. It's based on hundreds of years of data collection on climate, on soil, on temperature, on humidity, on the way that certain types of sediments are changed over time and it turns them into different types of rocks, or how certain kinds of rocks devolve into things like sand, and the action of water, wind, UV radiation, and so forth. So they eventually become geology and geography, the inorganic specialists. The inorganic specialists in those 2 pages, those couple people, and they introduce them in alongside Darwin a little bit later as well. They, in general, really set the stage for the species people, for the living people, to be able to little bit by little bit by little bit start saying that, yeah, organisms had to change over time, that everything had changed over time. It wasn't as dangerous to say that the world was older than 6,000 years as it was to say that the creation of species, which of course meant humans, wasn't exactly the same way that the Bible did. So they did get in trouble, and sometimes were brought in, and it demanded that in their books they had to change some things. So even in those days, saying that the world was 100,000 years old was really, really a big step forward to what it was really actually. Now, organic evolution is what we're studying in this class. This class, from just meeting this term and looking at this just once, we're never going to come back to it in the course, except for just the conclusions of the processes of sedimentation and so forth. But organic evolution, species evolution. So the rest of those people on there, Buffon, Cuvier, Saint-Hilaire, Lamarck, Darwin, Wallace, they're all looking at organic evolution. So organic just means living things. Again, why do I linger on these sometimes? Because when we're nervous or we're rushing or we're really, really busy, like college students usually are, and we have lots of things that we'd like to be doing, organic in social speech is something that we see on products that we're usually going to eat, right? And then we'll say, what does organic mean? It just means anything from nature. Or yeah, there's actually no firm legal definition of it, even in our food supply. But organic in this class just means living things. So organic evolution. How do species evolve? So the first of the independent sciences to come out of this for you all is taxonomy. And I know you know where to find that presentation and some of the rules of it. The first idea of giving organisms a science name, not the local one, but a science name, that 2-part name, genus and species, comes from John Ray, and then is expanded over time by the person who now we call Linnaeus for that one. So genus, generic, and species, the specific. So your genus and species, or taxonomy for that one. The first person to invent the term biology, you all, is actually way late in the process. The word is not even in use until almost 1800. So these people were generally just people looking at nature, and there aren't too many of them. So easy enough if you know what I want you to know about them, or what the focus on this is. So we're looking at organic evolution. How do organisms change over time? So these two, just to be sure that you're pretty comfortable and you know, and again, I know a few of us have added a little bit later, this vocabulary term, binomial nomenclature, you're going to find that over here in the module that says Unit 1, and that PowerPoint lesson on taxonomy. And this one as well, they're going to be defined there, but be sure that you're really comfortable with those and you know them. So the top of the chart always says kingdom, and the bottom of the chart, no matter what you're looking at, it could be an iguana, it could be a microorganism like a virus, and so forth. They're going to go down and have orders, families, tribes, genus, species, everything fits along the chart. So somebody go ahead and unmute yourself, or lots of you. What does the prefix by mean in science? What does by mean?
Two.
Yes, two. So, and the reason I'm bringing it up is for all of you that are here right now, even if you're getting tired while you answer exam questions in a science type class like this one, or you're doing your reading, it isn't, once you see some of these prefixes or suffixes, you don't have to always look up everything. It is part of what all professors who are really hoping that you're going to get comfortable and zoom through these things and finish degrees and go and do anything that you would like with your with what you know, that you can begin to not need us. So learning how to take these words apart, even if you don't remember reading it, is part of where we really want to be. So binomial means two, and then nom in French, Spanish, Portuguese, right? Nom means, and even in the Germanic languages, is related to, like nombre, name. It's the title of something, right? So it means this to name. So yeah, so just try to stay calm. A lot of times you can get at least a 50-50 on science type questions, especially if it's just a definition. You might not remember why you needed to know it, but for those, and a lot of times you can walk yourself through it and be accurate. And the more that we go through this class, it's going to happen for all of you that stay with it. So even if you're a little nervous right now, it will become something that you just get better. Go ahead.
Grab that in there too.
What was the question?
Oh, never mind. I'm sorry.
Okay, are you all good?
Yeah.
All right, okay. And again, if I can't get to it right here, you can put it in chat and we'll find some time. Okay, so immutable is also sometimes called fixity of species, and then that hierarchical organization, great chain of being. There's some people, it's not a large part of our population, they just are vocal and well-funded in some cases, really are still clinging to this, that things don't change. And great chain of being is kind of embedded into the way that we've all been trained from baby times onto the now, that everything works in society. So again, what does immutable mean? Every species was created by a perfected idea, and then each species should be completely separate from all others. And so again, there's Usher, spelled one more time. I build these repeats in on purpose, especially early in the class, because when you hear something a couple times or you jot it and you hear it, then it's more likely to cling into your short-term memory. Okay, it's pretty easy to see for you all right today in our society that this is at the root of our nastiest of our racist behaviors. Absolutely, and it's been going for a long time, and we haven't done all that our species should do in order to walk this back to either what you want to think is scientific reality or what's healthiest for human beings as a species. Not even really getting into the kindness, ethical behavior, and so forth mode. So yeah, it's been present for a really long time, and it's pathetic that it's still going at the rate that it is. All right, so. All right, so I'm gonna this is where it just starts, those two names for as far as going back in time, and then I'm gonna go forward to a couple of other ideas here, but we'll be right here. Let's take a break right now, because when I come back, I wanna move on to explanation, and that's a little bit more in some details, and I wanna make sure that, that you have a chance to take a little break. for these. Okay, so I'm going to leave this be. It is about 10 to 9, so let's come back at right about 9, and then we're going to go over and resume looking over the more complicated or involved ideas that start on page 19 in your textbook. Okay, so I'm going to end the show part here.
Excuse me.
Yeah, go ahead. Hello? Hello?
Self again.
Hello?
Hello?
Yeah.
I was going to say earlier when the link wasn't working, I was able to actually get back in by using
Is this
the
working?
meeting ID.
Okay.
So if I'm not sure if it was just because of the time, but maybe I'll post it into the forums or something. But if the link doesn't work anymore, maybe just have students enter in the meeting ID into the Zoom to join a call and see if that'll help.
Yes, for those of you that did it that way, would you, all of you, one of you, would you post your technique into the discussion board area? Because honestly, I haven't been able to get anyone to tell me why when I generate it and it tells me what the link is and it's unique to this particular time. And everything's set up and they look at it and go, yeah, it's perfect, it should work, that it's causing this type of annoyance for you. And I am like many of you, being annoyed at 7 o'clock in the morning is like, yikes, that's not good for that one. So if you're using another way that's really more reliable, honestly, I want to know too, because it didn't even let me in this morning and it's on my, official thing going on. So yes, and then I will, and if you can type out what your solution was. Maybe if I send that forward and say, this is what students are doing and when they're able to get in, then maybe they can tell me what's not getting set up right. Honestly, yeah, it hasn't been okay and it hasn't worked really, really smoothly. Well, actually a week ago it worked pretty smoothly. And then last Wednesday, it was kind of okay, but then at the 10:30 group, they had all kinds of problems. And it was the same thing where I was just trying to double check and then send the link again and having people come in and not. And particularly in this unit, I'm trying to do a double task on a couple things and let people back in. This one is really just getting you oriented, giving you a little breathing space and some confidence that you really know what kinds of questions there'll be and what we're gonna do. But meeting together for the group, and of course, I'm preaching to the ones of you that are already here, but once we get into genetics and heredity, you're just gonna get so much time-saving information and structure by meeting together and going over things rather than just leaving you be with either just a copy of the text or some students are saying, well, if you could just do it and then just post it and then I'll watch it later. And I'm like, oh, watching it later just eats more hours out of your day, right? I mean, this 2.5 hour window is really your most efficient time to then go on and then not be worried that you've done some other stuff. So I'm learning too how to do this better. So thank you so much for any tips that you would have. They're strongly appreciated. So let me see, I'm gonna do this and send it to you, give you an idea of what we're gonna do. Okay. Down here. And then enter. Okay, so I just put something in chat. This just gives you a little idea of what we're going to be doing for Wednesday, because I want to wrap up any sorts of things. I am not overemphasizing all this stuff because I don't think that you all can do this. I know that you can. But when you take a course on a topic that you've never ever had a course on, it's very difficult for students to target what the main ideas are versus those that are not, and to really know what I might be hoping that you're going to be able to do and so forth. And so I really, really, really strongly like to have the best setup that we can. But on Wednesday, I'm gonna prep chapter 3 for you, which is, of all the chapters in the book, probably the messiest one with biochemistry and other sorts of things, and give you some ideas of really how to work with that. And then once you finish your exam, in the second hour, so there'll be a window where you can log in, and then it'll be about 25 minutes of just answering some questions, and then you'll be done. Then you'll know what to do with the rest of your week to prep to come back and meet. If we waste an entire 6 days as a group, then it will be very hairy for scoring and nervousness. There shouldn't be any nervousness about all this, or at least as little as possible for that one. Okay, so I'm going to go back and we're going to move over to thinking about Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, and I'm also going to link them up to Lamarck. So if you've got Canvas open and you've got the textbook there, that you can follow along in the textbook and you'll be able to see some of the things that I'm calling out for that. I'm really not adding any new information that's there. I just want to be sure that I'm calling out stuff that I'm sure that you need to see, so that you're not just thinking that maybe it's all definitions, because there's going to be some other links. And so, but if you go over to Canvas now, you'll be able to see the textbook and follow along. But I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to pull up here as well. Okay. And we'll look at this one for now. Okay. And I think I'll go back one. Okay, Lamarck. Lamarck at the very end of the 1700s. So he's right there, one of the more recent of the people that are there. So right about the 1800 time changeover. Lamarck is the first of the prominent Western scientists to finally say, look, people have been collecting data on species and the planet for 300 years, and it all points to the same conclusion, no matter who they are, even if they don't want to get in trouble and legally say, oh yeah, these species became extinct, and that's because change exists. The same thing is there. We've already have plenty of data to say that yes, the world is changing, species change, and the planet is changed, and that's the natural way that everything works. So the first person who says, well, I want to be kind of more cutting edge, not that that was the phrase in 1790, but more or less the way we think, is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Lamarck is a very interesting person historically. One of the things that's very interesting about him is that he is kind of an early bird leader on something that lots of you are going to really want to see happen in your life as well, which is to have a second or third career. If you all begin working in your 20s, our basic statistical lifespan for humans today gives you at least 3 long-term periods of time in your life where you can get close on to 20 years in one particular line of work. So Lamarck actually switched to being very interested in species naturalism, and was the first person to invent the term biology. At the time that he joined this, though, his interest was overwhelmingly in not saying, do species evolve, but in saying, why do species evolve? If it's happening, what is it about the world that's causing those things to occur? So he didn't really start that work till he was a much more mature individual. Wealthy, yes, all these early people, except for actually Linnaeus was not wealthy. He started off with a very, very small amount of things in the early 1700s, and but did additions and additions of his book and became very socially prominent. So Lamarck. So Lamarck puts together a theory. He has data. He knows to use stats and other ways of examination. He's working in the Syndic of the Sorbonne in France, and I'm sorry, I've never studied French, so I'm sure that was poorly pronounced, and I apologize for those of you that know how to do it better. He's got museums. He's got libraries. He has access to all the leading thinkers, whether they're studying fossils or geology, or whether they're studying living species, or whether they're studying anatomy, or whether they're studying embryos. And you all just put a little star in whatever your notes are right now. In that one article that's posted in Blackboard that says, was Darwin wrong? No. There won't be any questions about the pictures, right? It's really about what kind of work was Darwin doing, and what was Darwin's data. Darwin had a lot more data than just going on a boat voyage and being gone for several years and looking birds and tortoises and iguanas and things like that. He had a huge amount of data, because remember, that data started in the 1600s. So please be sure and see the reason that Darwin was correct and Lamarck was not, and we replaced his theory with an improved version, was that Darwin is 3 generations later. He's about 60 years later with his work than Lamarck first started, and at least a good 40 years later. And he had lots of other scientists had put together lots of other work. So science works best, and we start to increase the pace of discovery when we have access to each other's data, which is why it always needs to be global. So for instance, again, right now today, the US is not going to get where we need to be as fast as we need it to be with curing this particular virus or better treatments if we don't share data with other large, technically sophisticated societies, whether it's China, whether it's Japan, whether it's France, Italy, whether it's Latin America, whether it's in the Middle East. When scientists share data, then the pace of resolution or understanding picks up big time. Making these little walls of, well, we don't like those people, so we're not going to use their data. It slows everything down, and we don't need it to be slow. We need to be well. So his theory, he called inheritance of acquired characteristics. Inheritance of acquired characteristics. This is, you all, for your notes, the first or earliest known attempt to make a theory for how evolution occurs. So, and then this will come up this unit in the next. Evolution, remember, just means change over time. Evolution is change over time. And therefore, with that, it is not directional. Evolution, please make a little note or just make a mental note. It does not mean improvement. Evolution does not. It means change. Change in how often something occurs. Change in a characteristic that you see in a species. Change in the resolution of what happens with the species. So our modern definition and the definition of evolution for many, beginning about the mid-1800s and on, does include that many species become extinct. Extinction is a form of evolution because it is a form of change. So extinction is evolution. The emergence of a new species is evolution. But species that get larger over time is evolution. Or species nowadays that you can see it in your own lives that are beginning to be very comfortable in living in and around human communities and are doing very well, that's a form of evolution. So it isn't directional. There isn't any mandatory end zone. And it isn't, evolution means everything will eventually become human or with human characteristics. I read that sometimes online, sometimes. So Lamarck did have a couple of things that he put forward. And this one here, for the second bullet here, he put forward a couple things in his work that were accurate and got the race started for everybody that was able to improve on his ideas. What Lamarck said was, it doesn't matter whether I'm looking at data of people collecting specimens in the Americas or in the Philippines or in Africa or in Scandinavia. Every time we see the specific local version of that particular mammal or plant or amphibian or fish or whatever it is, we see that it has a close relationship to the environment. To you all, this seems like just everybody knew this, but it was key that he put this as the first step. His first step really was probably his largest contribution in this. So again, a theory is an explanation based on data. He didn't have enough data to get this to last very long, but he did work through with the basic parts of this. Now, his idea of that relationship between an organism and in its environment had to do with then passing it on so that those parent organisms would pass on those changes to their offspring. And what his mistake was, because he wasn't coming from a background where he raised his own animals, or whether he was breeding horses or fighting dogs or raising crops or doing something like that, was that those changes that stuck, changes in a species that stuck and were passed on to their offspring, actually happened or changed while the individual organism was going through its lifespan. It's easy to see how Lamarck thought it worked that way, but it turns out that for large-scale evolution, this was not the right spot to take a look at this particular process. Okay, so I'm going to go and we'll add a little bit more so you can do think about compare contrast of Lamarck and what comes next. So again, Lamarck's theory is called inheritance of acquired characteristic, and acquired here was here, that those changes happen during your own lifespan. The inheritance part is correct. He just wasn't correct in noticing when those things were collected or how and when they would be passed on. Okay. And yes, some people call this Lamarckianism today, but that's not going to help you remember what Lamarck thought. So I will not use Lamarckianism as a term within testing in a class like this, where you'll see it as inheritance of acquired characteristics. Okay. All right. So Lamarck, like you can see here, Lamarck's idea was that while organisms were in their lifespan, that they had to do things in order to stay alive. They needed to be able to find whatever it was they ate. They needed to find nesting space. They might need to elude dangerous circumstances and so forth. So you all, somebody go ahead and unmute. What's the term that we use when we say an organism is able to survive in its own local environment? What is that term? Starts with A. We say that the species is?
Adaptive.
Yes, you are absolutely correct. That's what adapted is. Adaptive just means that the species, where it actually has to live during its own lifespan, can stay alive. Adaptation for us, and actually at the bottom line right now, just means you can stay alive. Are you adapted to this particular environment? If you have, and we can see that sometimes people, even if they have pet animals, particularly birds, if you let them outside in some environments, they're not adapted for it and they can't survive. But people, for instance, here in San Diego, if they let their pet parrots go, San Diego is a very comfortably warm with enough fruit and seed supplies area where parrots can survive oftentimes. And so if you go around Point Loma area, Ocean Beach, there's a couple of other communities, they're in big flocks and you can see them screaming and running around and they're doing pretty well. So adaptation, that's all it means. Can you stay alive? It doesn't mean are you fast? It doesn't mean are you strong? It doesn't mean any one thing, right? Because it has to be every species. These have to fit everything. Plants, animals, microorganisms, bugs, mammals, egg-laying things. So Lamarck, usually in your intro textbooks, they'll either show you a diagram of elephants or giraffes. I don't know when it became that way, but that's usually the ones. So they say, well, if a long time ago in the past, that the food that was available in the driest part of the season for elephants was in trees, then the way that an elephant could reach it is by trying to stretch up with its trunk. And those that tried the hardest would somehow stimulate their body to grow a longer trunk. And when they did that, they could get more food than those that weren't trying hard enough. And then when they became a sperm donor or an ova donor, then that longer trunk characteristic would be there in the baby. And the baby would be born with a longer trunk. And that inheritance then, because the first parent really tried harder than most of the rest of the herd, would then become established, and then that would be better adapted. So it's easy to see that this might be a little confusing, shouldn't be confusing to you all, but again, sometimes we accept things because you never had to think about it, right? If I ask you how many ribs you have, you never needed to really know unless you broke one or you had to have one removed, then you might know. But otherwise, your body's doing what it needs to do, and you don't need to know that to be awesome and adapted and enjoying your life. So it is not unusual that when we have some of these examples that we can point out where people today get a little bit of confusion going on with these things. Because if we even look at humans, when humans exercise a lot, does your body change? It does, right? You get bigger muscles and you can frequently see them. If you stretch a lot, you'll be able to be more flexible, and that's pretty visual that you can see that you're getting further to bend over or lean back or do the splits or whatever it is. People that practice certain things to improve their memory actually can improve their memory. If you don't run for a long time and then you start running, when you first start, you're out of breath. After a while, clearly that whole system improves. So they knew that it was possible for organisms to change during their lifetime. He just didn't realize how that was and whether or not that could be changed. So for those examples, those were all ones where you get healthier, right? You're doing something more that'll help you with respiration, or your how well your heart is working, or how less clogged your arteries are, or so forth. But we have other things that are also physical changes, like you have an accident and you lose some of your fingers, or you do military service and you've lost use of your lower limbs. Or we have an injury and your skin is scarred and really, really damaged and doesn't look like it did before, and it doesn't stretch as much as it did before. All those other things, right? Or even something on the superficial, getting a tattoo, for instance. When we really think about it that way, or let's say you have a surgery and they remove one of your kidneys because you're a kidney donor and an awesome human being. But when your children are born, they're not missing a kidney, or they're not born with breast implants because the mother had them, or with the tattoos that were there in the present. So the changes that happen during your lifetime do not pass to your offspring. As soon as people jumped on Lamarck's theory and realized that, yes, he was correct, organisms are adapted to the environment, and the environment changes. So species must be able to evolve. Otherwise, there wouldn't be anything left alive on the planet. That starting point was correct, but then the mechanism for the changes over time was not. Lamarck also thought that evolution was directional, that they got better and better and better in some particular way and then stayed there. In other words, they were imperfect in this version over here. Let me see if we can get my little thing too. They were imperfect here. This would be not a good version, but as they got this way, then they were getting close to perfection for the world. Again, that part was correct, that it is not directional. It doesn't go from less complex to more complex. Things change because the environment is going to change, and that is just adapted. It's just being adapted. He also didn't understand how those things might actually happen because there was no science of biochemistry. There was no even word gene until about 1906. So they didn't have any of those concepts that you have today. So it's easy to see. So within a short period of time, Lamarck's view was discarded, and Darwin's view eventually begins to replace it with the new the new theory. And the name of Darwin's theory is natural selection. So in no case, there aren't going to be any questions. If it's asking about theory, the word evolution is not the name of the theory. Darwin's theory is natural selection. Nature selects. Evolution is just the natural process where things change over time. Also in this conversation, another name that you don't want to pass by is Alfred Russel Wallace. There's a breakout page in your textbook. Sometimes students skip those, but please do read it. It's page 24. It says Darwin versus Wallace. When Alfred Russel Wallace was quite young, he was interested in the same question. How do you explain how species evolve? And Wallace's work was not taking place within Europe or the Mediterranean area. Wallace, while he was younger and collecting data, was living in Indonesia. Wallace was also not connected politically or from the type of wealthy academic type social class as Darwin. And here's but he was well known later on in life. And here's another portrait of him later in life. As your textbook mentions, Alfred Russel Wallace in 1858 sent Charles Darwin a letter and said, everyone tells me that you've been working on this question of how species evolve. And I wanted to run by my ideas by you because I have developed a theory and you seem like you would be the best person to tell me what you think or if you have any suggestions. But in 1858, Darwin had already been working on this for over 20 years. So it's why we socially, not just in class, but socially remember Charles Darwin's name more so than Alfred Russel Wallace. But they presented, their ideas were presented to the public at about exactly the same time. In fact, actually at the same day. The papers were read both on the same day. So I'm going to stop this one and call up another one that's a little bit more focused for a second. Where are my others here? I know you don't want to look at this stuff, but I'll be quick. All right. Okay. So Charles Darwin, his theory is natural selection, and the name of his book, not the first book that he wrote a lot of books, but the name of his book that lays out natural selection and for the first time in its whole length is called The Origin of Species. Not too long after that, he published a second book on the same topic. And in the first one, Origin of Species, he on purpose left out mentioning humans. But once The Origin of Species was released, it was a huge hit. It sold out. He was celebrated in academic world. There were people that didn't like him, but they weren't people who were scientists to begin with. And then everyone jumped on it and tried to critique and so forth. So this came out just before 1860. And since 1860 to 2020, so that's right. Yeah, go ahead. Just one second, Matthew. That modern science has been trying to tear down this theory, and it has not happened. They've added some preconditions that Darwin wasn't trying to study, but this is our strongest statement of explanation that exists with science on how species change. Okay, go ahead, Matthew, go ahead.
I think you're still sharing the old PowerPoint. You haven't
I'm
actually.
showing this one. Okay, sorry about that. Thank you for telling me when I make mistakes. I would much rather know than not know.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, can you see it now?
Now I just see the cameras of everybody sharing their video.
Okay, here we go. Let me try it one more time. All right. So, let me go to this one.
There we go. Now we see a slide that says Charles Darwin, Natural Selection and the Origin of Species.
All right, that was what I was hoping for. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Again, it's why you all that I am so much one of those people where I'm like second chances, extra credit, you know, going over things. Everybody makes mistakes, and the only way we ever get better is when other people point them out nicely like you just did, and then we get to start again. Okay, so Charles Darwin. The Origin of Species was the title of his first book, and it does not include specific mention of humans. He wasn't really worried about this. And it was very popular. For most of you today, modern popular culture has told you since you were born and long before you were born that Darwin was somebody that no one believed, that he wasn't popular, that he was an idiot, that he was just saying stuff. And that's not accurate. This is a meme that's been disseminated by anti-science or anti-evolutionary groups of people for the last century or so. That's not the majority of people working within studying species or nature or evolution. And so we see some of these cartoon kind of things. Sometimes I've even seen anti-Darwin bumper stickers. Here's the other one. Again, and it will be for sure a test or quiz question. Charles Darwin is not associated mainly with evolution. He is a theorist, right? He's not the first person to collect data. He isn't the first person to define what evolution is for organic or species evolution. His entire place here, as well as Lamarck, they are making explanations. So he's explaining. Lamarck, his wasn't accurate enough. Darwin and Wallace come at just close to 1860. And publish this, do a public presentation reading of the two papers, and then his book comes out right away after that. Charles Darwin wasn't going to really put it out all that fast because he really never felt in the 20 years he was working on it that there was any competition and he didn't need to rush. Usually also in the cartoons, we only see images of Darwin when he's really, really elderly, but he comes from a wealthy family and from a long line of other science type uncles and previous generations of his family. There's lots of reasons that we've been looking at in this first unit about how science works and how we discover things that actually come to play with his success here. So usually there's a lot of big deal, and then there's a lot of videos and things like that about Darwin going on the ship called the Beagle. Really interestingly enough, Charles Darwin's family, when he was young, didn't actually think he was going to be somebody who could really increase the family's standing socially. And because people really did, people of wealth in this particular part of the world really did write a lot of letters and then save those letters. We actually have correspondence from Darwin's father to Charles Darwin when he was younger, and saying that he's been basically subphrasing, he's been an embarrassment to the family, and they're very, very concerned that all he wants to do is roam around the family estate farms. His family had large agricultural holdings in Britain. and go out with the dogs and shoot rats and basically just killed time, and that everybody was pissed and he was making them look bad. However, Darwin wasn't really sure what exactly he was mainly interested in anyway, but he was educated. He knew how to do math and stats. He knew that looking at things also required taking a sample, or at least making the best illustration of it that you could. And he knew that keeping every single experience in a diary and a notebook would be the way to not only remember what happened later, but to see and remember things that you didn't recall were going to be important. But when he gets back is really what I want to look at with you for a few minutes here, because when he gets back is when we see his life is basically a good example of the scientific approach and the scientific method. So let's do that a little bit. So Darwin wrote a lot of books, papers, and presentations. His first one was published within Zoology, The Voyage of the Beagle, and in his book, are there any more? Yeah, he did some other journals. He was there on the ship to be their naturalist. He was there to collect this kind of data. You might be aware already that that ship spent a prolonged period of time in the Galapagos Islands, which hadn't really been looked at other than people living in that part of the world in any particular detail. And it was clear when Darwin was doing his notebooks that they did have some unusual things going on, but he didn't have any real compare contrast. But the thing they usually don't talk about is that they spent a lot of time on mainland South America. So he's also able to collect samples of birds, mainly the types of birds that a lot of analysis was able to show that something interesting was going on, were a type of bird called finches. That the finches on the continent were not exactly the same as the finches on the islands, and on each island they were slightly different. When he saw tortoises and other similar types of things on the mainland, they were not much like the Galapagos tortoises, which are huge. And tortoises on different islands were not exactly identical to each other either. He saw iguanas that were swimming out into the ocean to get something to eat. That I would personally like to see. But there were lots of iguanas on the mainland, and they never went near the beach, nor did they try to get in the water. So he had a lot of stuff in his journals, and back in the day, most people didn't travel because they couldn't afford to, and it was really, really slow. So also take a look. He was actually an officer of the big meeting groups where people who were acknowledged experts in geology, in zoology, in the life sciences and so forth, and in science in general, would meet and share and socialize. So he was already recognized, partly because of who he was related to and partly because he was good at getting his books out, as somebody who was really important from the very beginning. That evolution by means of natural selection is not the first or only thing he was working on. Here's something else that we looked at last week, and that it's trying to emphasize in your reading, that these huge breakthroughs with generating theories always come when you're working with other people, reading other books, seeing what's already been done, or running your thoughts and analyses by other people. So Richard Owen and John Gould were his best friends, and they were actually instrumental with another individual of getting him, once he got the letter from Alfred Russel Wallace, to just get your thing together and publish the thing and get it out there, because you don't want it to be a question that you already wrote this book and you haven't released it yet. So Richard Owen was an expert on fossils. So when Darwin brought back explanations, it wasn't really photography, it would have to be drawings, and then samples of dead animals, which they were preserving either in salt or oil, or just bringing their skins back and so forth. He was able to compare them with things that were in museums. But John Gould was a bird specialist, and it might have been really that his working together with John Gould, who wasn't mainly working on the question of why do species change, but just inventories of species, to where he really saw what Darwin would not have been able to see, because Darwin wasn't a bird specialist to that. So working together really ends up mattering. That's the big concept of this slide, not 12 species. Okay, here we go. So Darwin starts after his meetings with Gould in particular, and all of his drawings and his dead birds that he brought back with him preserved to look at later as a young man. And he writes in his notebooks that as he saw that the birds were really similar overall, but when they looked at some of the details of them, in particular the shape of the beak or bill, however you might want to call it, that there must have been something going on, that from an original type of bird, that a whole bunch of variants had evolved or come out over periods of time. And this is where his notes and other researchers' notes really mattered. That, for instance, like here on this one, I'll do the highlight. This one, like here where you see a beak where, or this part where it's really thick and not too long, versus one that's more curved, versus here longer, which on some of these long and slender and very, very pointy, that he needed to know once he got home, where did he see this bird and what did he see it eating? Where did he see this bird and what did he see it eating? And he began to notice that while they were really, really similar, depending on exactly where they fit in the environment, that over time that these changes had become established, and that then after the changes were established, that this kind of bird never mated and nested with this type of bird, that they saw each other, but they didn't produce babies with each other. So this is really, you know, yeah, in 1800 speak, it's a little bit slow to read this, but this is where he gets his first idea about change over time. Now this one, oh, and just as a reminder, this is in, without the longer explanation, this is in Canvas too, if you wanted to take a look at it. So we know that at least by 1839, so 20 years before he released this to the public, he already had lots of, not just his notes from the voyage, but other things. And then he started the specific notebooks that led to On the Origin of Species. He initially called evolution transmutation, evolution of an organism. He was thinking of it as transmutation, right? Change, transfer of change from one part to another. Now this image right here, this is Darwin's Tree of Life, and it is one of the most famous illustrations in all of modern science when science has something to do with biology. The number of people that have this as a tattoo and then have posted their tattoo of the Tree of Life is a lot. You can find a lot of images of that on there. There's jewelry, there's engraved things on bracelets. Somebody some time ago gave me a necklace that's in the shape of Darwin's Tree of Life. I really liked it because it's just one of those significant moments. And you can see what he thought happening. He thought there was, for instance, an original type of bird. And then as birds moved into new environments, or as time went on, that some of these new small variants became established. And therefore it was like the trunk of a tree moving into branching over time. So branching evolution. So soon as he had this idea, he writes in there, I was going to collect every sort of fact, every bit of data that might have anything at all to do with the idea of what is a species. And it was everything from embryology to comparative anatomy to osteology. There were lots of other sciences, and he took his time. Now this one, this statement you all hear, from this work I became convinced that species are not immutable. It's like confessing a murder. This doesn't mean that he doubted himself. I see this sometimes pop up for people that are anti-science, where they're not when they're not interested in recognizing that things change over time on the planet, between living things or just the planet itself. Now, Darwin was in an exceptionally happy marriage. He was married to, as a young man, a woman who was from a family even wealthier than his own, and his was definitely well off. And she was not a first cousin, but a cousin. And in another unit, we'll talk about why cousin marriage among humans doesn't make any real genetic problems statistically. We just don't do it for other reasons in our culture. Actually, it is done commonly, but in some states you're not allowed to. What he meant was, as a person who was active member of his community parish, and so was his wife, they were definite believers in God, believers in the Bible, participants in their parish, they followed, and this was an important part of their lives. What he knew is that to just start talking about this to people who their whole lives and in all the generations of their family had always accepted that the Bible was the absolute history of everything that had ever happened, would be, for some people, emotionally upsetting. He was concerned about this being emotionally upsetting. His wife was as well. They didn't want to make other believers in something that for humans and humanity was important for them, for their social welfare and social well-being, to call into question the other doctrines and teachings in the document. But he knew he was going to say, this is the death of, in the beginning, the Creator created everything in X amount of days, and then it was set. Then there were no more changes. He knew that that was going to be there. But if you sometimes, just like the stuff that happens in social media, you take one sentence or two sentences clip, or 20 seconds out of a video clip, it could look like something totally different is going on than actually was. But yes, he was a good person in that regards, and he knew that that might make some people uncomfortable. Did it stop him? No. Did his wife leave him? No. Did they think he wasn't going to heaven? They were still sure he was going to go to heaven. This was not the opposite of being a believer. This was just understanding how the planet worked. So, for instance, so in terms of that variation, depending on adaptation, right? Being able to stay alive. On the left, we have an image here of a tortoise, a Galapagos tortoise, and you can see the shell top angles up on all of them in the colony on this one particular zone. And its neck is longer. Yeah, they're kind of wrinkly, but they're just the most interesting looking things. The shells will allow them to stretch their neck up higher because, as you can see, it's a drier island area and they need to reach up to get things to eat that might be on shrubs. On the islands that are wetter, then we don't see that the shell works that way. So in the right, he could see easily that these species never needed this alteration in order to feed efficiently. So again, it's running that question. How did they go from all being the same to having some variance? Darwin, because his family was wealthy and ran farms, I could say ranches, but they don't really use that word in the British Isles, in farms, he already knew what people were doing when they were raising hunting dogs, racing horses, racing pigeons, other animals just to be pretty, when they were raising cows for milk versus cows for meat, when the cows were in an area where it was cold versus super hot. He knew far more than Lamarck when it came to what happens from generation to generation when humans are raising animals. Now, the term for this sometimes, when humans are doing selection on their flock or on their pets or their herds or so forth, we sometimes say that's artificial selection, because we're choosing the characteristics that we want in the animal, not that they need in order to live without us. But actually, scientifically or genetically, the same basic principles are kind of happening, which is not all the parents are allowed to pass on characteristics. And then if we see one with something unusual. So for instance, we've got like our typical kind of pigeon here that are streamlined and have the shorter plainer feathers that were used right in warfare for delivering messages. We still have pigeon racing and things like that. But occasionally a chick would be born that had something that was an oddball characteristic. Like this one, you can see that it's got wing-like feathers that are growing from its feet. Humans like the look of that, so they're like, yeah, we're not eating that one. We're going to actually make it so that it gets more mating and it has more eggs, and we're going to save all of its babies that look weird. Look at this one. There is a type where they've got these like warty, like leathery extra rings around the eye and the top of the bill. Some people like that. So when one is born that way, they save it and make sure it's apparent, and every baby chick that's hatched that has that characteristic, we keep. If we like a different color or that their tail does something odd. This one has these wing feathers and a big tail. Or this one where we've got this really fancy scruffy feathers that pop up at the back of the neck for this one. If we want that, all we have to do is make sure they survive and become parents. Darwin knew exactly how that worked. Darwin knew also, though, if you had a champion racehorse that was a stallion and it really ran fast, that if you wanted to try to get foals, that babies that would also be more likely to run fast, that you needed to make sure that the mother was either a fast runner or came from parents that were fast runner. But everyone already knew, and you all that bet on horse racing already know this too, that you can have two fast running parents and the offspring might not be super fast. So that was the part, right, where they did not in the 1800s have any way to answer why it didn't always pass on. We just knew that it usually passed on. And so, hello, Jerry, let's get back into the group here. So artificial selection isn't really different in terms of genetically how it works, but the adaptation is for us. So I noticed in my neighborhood that of the last couple years, the most popular dogs that people are clearly, that you need to purchase, that aren't just like, you know, mutts that you can get at the shelter or for free from your neighbors, that some of the most popular dogs are different types of bulldogs. So the little Frenchies, the bigger bulldogs, the pit bulldogs, and so forth, they're probably 50% of the type of dogs I see people walking around. And one of the things about, especially the littler ones, is they are really, really slow and they can't breathe very well. They're so damn cute, but they're not good at breathing. And frequently they also have little bulgy eyes that make it kind of a little bit difficult for their eyes to have good health. As long as we take care of them, those characteristics are fine. But I'm sure, as you know, if you turn out, which is why some of you, if you have dogs, the best dog parks are where they have the little dogs in one area and the big dogs in another. Because if a big dog goes after a little one, it wouldn't last in nature unless you protect it or defend it. But so there's all those variations. There's dogs that are really good at hunting. There are dogs that don't give a shit about hunting. There's dogs that are really good about jumping over things and others that really want to dig. There's some that are very aggressive for biting everything other than the one individual that it's most interested in protecting. And so those changes aren't to make them better in the landscape, they're better for humans. And the same thing with cats, the same thing with a whole bunch of other kinds of critters for this one. Hello. Now, let's see if we can get this to move forward. Let's try if I do something else. It's sometimes I'm having problems with things stalling and all of this. So let me go back to running this way for us. Okay, so when humans make those selections, he knew that already happened and he knew that they would end up looking differently and behaving more differently. So all he had to do was take that over to his big data set from wild species and move along with that. So Thomas Malthus, which some of you might have met in other courses, like the beginnings of modern Western economic history. Thomas Malthus was not interested in biology or evolution or any of that stuff. He was interested in economics. He was interested in social strata in human populations. He was really looking at things in a very particularly targeted way about understanding things like why there were social classes in human urban society all over the world and so forth. So Darwin said he was going to look at everything, and so he did. And actually, Alfred Russel Wallace was also heavily influenced by this work by Malthus. Malthus said about looking at humans that there was always going to be overpopulation in every community, and that what he saw happening socially, which to him was something that he thought would never change, is that if for certain social classes that they would always overpopulate and that they would never be able to improve their survival characteristics. They would never be able to improve the likelihood of whether their offspring survived or didn't survive, and so on and so forth. And that that ability to overpopulate would always lead to some part of the group not surviving for very long. Either not making it out of immaturity, or never becoming parents, or being parents and having children that never survived long enough to pass on their characteristics. So for Darwin, this was his really light bulb moment, this idea of overpopulation. This is really how he got started with thinking about nature selects, and those last couple bullets there. So this would be on page 23 and 25. They start this with this details in your reading. So by the end of 1838, these are the basic things that he was noticing, that individuals of one population in one area, some would have more favorable variations that would allow them, that would live long enough to reproduce. So if you have a highlighter or you're using a couple colors, reproduction here is the key idea. Once he realized that whatever your characteristic was, that those that reproduced passed it to the future, and that is what success was. So natural selection favors any parent who can live long enough and successfully enough to have a baby who then also makes it to giving them a grandchild. If that's a grasshopper, it works the same. If it's a palm tree that makes a seed and then there's another tree that makes seeds, it's the same. If it's a microorganism, it's the same. It has to work for everything. So it's really about whatever you need to do in your current natural environment in order to reproduce. So individuals who didn't have those favorable variations for evolution conversation would either not survive or not successfully reproduce. So that's where he came with nature, though, is the selection, is the judge. So reproduction gives the pool of options, and then nature selects which current inventory of options is going to give you the survival that you're looking for. So here you all, you're humans, you see all the stuff that goes on in our news and that sort of thing. Do you have to be awesomely good at making a living to be a parent who has children that survive and reproduce in our species today? You don't, right? You don't really even have to take the greatest care of your offspring. Sometimes you can't because parents have biological or maybe mental illness. Sometimes you can't because society doesn't allow the parents to do that. Sometimes there's other sorts of things going on. But again, it always holds the same. If your children keep going and they pass that, you know it's genetics onto the future, then you've had natural success. Nature has said, yes, you've got what you need to do to keep going, to pass this along and participate in the future. So it isn't This is not about a hierarchy of getting more perfect. It's not about a hierarchy of only the best. In fact, you just can't come in last. It's kind of like those shows where it's like the Great Race, where for almost every single week, you don't have to win as long as you don't come in last. You're not the one that's eliminated. So here's where it starts at the top. What Darwin saw and what natural selection theory says is every individual of a species in a group has some variation. We don't notice those variations unless you, for instance, really study pigeons for a living, or we don't really notice the difference between every single different palm tree or every different ladybug. But if you really study them, they do have differences. We do notice those differences individually in humans, and we notice those differences in our pet animals. So if you have had lots of puppies or kittens or pet birds or even pet reptiles in your life, you'll know that they all have slightly different personalities or physiology or speed or intelligence or something like that. I have one cat that really has good three-dimensional thinking. It can figure out if it can't get something it wants from one direction, that it might be able to go around back or over the top or underneath and still get something that it wants. And I have another one that never even tries that. It just knows where something is, where it's seen it, and it'll let me know if it wants something by just sitting there. He's still very sweet, but he's not the problem solver. The other one is annoying, but he is a better problem solver in that particular way. So individuals all vary. Every single species of everything over reproduces. Overpopulation should be what we always see to everything on the planet, but we don't. The population numbers of most species of everything remain stable from generation to generation. And not to be mean, but humans are grossly overpopulated. We have far more people on the planet than we can house, provide water, provide space, provide education, opportunity, employment, and housing for, let alone medical or other sorts of things. Because of other things that we'll look at later on in this course. When a species is overpopulated, then there are always external factors that will reduce the total population in ways that are painful, like plagues, or like starvation, or like not having water, or like something going after you and overfeeding on you. But when you have an excess of offspring, then it means the amount of babies will outnumber the amount of food, for instance, or the amount of space. And then that's where that word struggle comes from. So you all just so that it doesn't become something that holds you back for answering questions. Struggle doesn't mean they fight with each other. Plants don't struggle with each other in terms of physical activity or interaction. But the ones that grow faster shade out the ones that are growing more slowly. And for a lot of species, if they don't have enough sun, then they don't survive, or they don't ever produce seeds, and so forth. So that struggle just means whatever is going on for that particular species in order to find what it needs and be able to have babies. So an unfavorable combination there is just going to make it so that some of the offspring, like here with the little X's, can't survive or reproduce in that environment. So if you introduced, going back to that picture we just saw, the type of tortoises that have the very low top to the shell in the front, if they got moved onto a place where there's no grass growing close to the ground and everything was coming off of shrubs or that was taller, a few would survive, but mainly they wouldn't, because they wouldn't be able to reach up in the new environment. They could digest it if they could get it, but they don't have what they exactly need for that new environment. This is what we see in nature right now, right? As San Diego County gets bigger and bigger and bigger, we're starting to see that lots of our natural species are completely gone, but some are getting super numerous and they're doing very, very well. When I was a kid going to high school and middle school across from Southwestern campus, We saw tons of seagulls as soon as it was lunchtime or anyone was out snacking. The seagulls would be there. They would actually fly off with your food if you set it down. We were in high school, who gave a shit, usually, but they were waiting till we all went back in, and then they would go pull everything out of the trash cans and eat all the sandwiches or other stuff that was gone. But now what I see is crows, huge flocks of them everywhere. I hardly see any seagulls in and around where people are. Crows are doing very, very well. And I see them in my backyard because I have a fountain that just puts a little bubble in a really shallow basin so that small birds can come and not drown in it. But crows come and bring stuff like that they get out of trash cans that's super dry that they can't eat. Like the other day, a little bastard came with a whole totally dried out piece of I think it was a bagel. It was hard as a rock, and the asshole stuck it in my fountain until it got soft and then ate it. Oh, crows are really smart. But it also fouled the water, and I had to take all the water out of the basin of it, which is below ground, so it's not wasting water all the time and dehydrating, and then refilled the whole thing. I was like, ugh. But crows eat lots of stuff. They'll eat human garbage, but I've also seen them come in my backyard and grab a lizard and then beat its brains out on my porch step. And while my cats are looking through the window, acting afraid. I was kind of afraid too. So there are some species that do well around humans, and you know the most popular, rats. Rats are doing very well around humans because we throw away a lot of stuff they can eat. So they like there being more humans. So the offspring that survive are those that just had traits that were well suited to that environment, and they're going to reproduce at a higher rate. Over long periods of time, you'll have certain variants that become very, very rare, or they might disappear altogether. Over time, it just repeats and repeats and repeats. And we'll learn more details about this when we get to the next unit. This, what you've got in those couple pages there, between 25 and 26 and the one before, is all that you need for right now for types of questions. And we'll just learn a little bit more as we go on with this. Okay, so again, here's, you don't need to write this down, it's in your textbook, just putting it there so that you know there's a couple of steps to this. So again, success, which got the nickname fitness for natural selection theory, that certain individuals within your species have fitness. That fitness is reproduction. It's reproductive fitness. It isn't strength or speed or intelligence. It's just, did you pass your code on to the future? It got co-opted by a whole bunch of other kinds of fields, and now we see it in advertising for gyms and things like that, and so forth. But fitness for you is, does that baby, whatever it is, have the genetic and behavioral combination that it needs in order to live long enough to reproduce? Once it reproduces, then it is successful. So natural selection just selects for characteristics that help you to live long enough to get to that reproductive phase. So guess what, you all, and well, I'm wrapping up right now, and then if you have some questions, I can linger, but I'll let you go in a couple here. For humans, our reproductive best period of time, when we're really fertile and we're likely to reproduce without any genetic problems or with surviving offspring and so on and so forth, is up until your late 30s. So natural selection does shape our species for characteristics that are there from birth until certain things that take place through your about middle 30s. But as you've probably noticed from talking to or being around people that are older, at about 40, our fertility isn't very good. Our immune system doesn't work as very well. Our joints are frequently worn out. We're not really as efficient with eating food. We're not as fast. We can't remember things as well. Our knees are hurting. All kinds of other things start going on. Why doesn't natural selection make it so that as long as we live, we're in that optimal about age 30 health stage? And that's because natural selection doesn't care how long we live after we've reproduced. So natural selection isn't what's going to make you healthy, happy, and active in later middle age and as a senior. It's just making it so that while you're young, and you've already noticed this, that even if you don't exercise, or even if you eat tons of junk food, or even if you don't get much rest, or even if you don't know or have to worry about what's nutritious in your diet or not nutritious, or so on and so forth, you're still exceptionally good looking, exceptionally energetic, exceptionally physically attracted to attractive to other members of our species. And that's because natural selection has tuned those genetics up. But the things that happen with decline after reproductive highest probability time, those are things that we personally have to plan for and keep going, because there's nothing over time for our species that has actually made it better. So one of the challenges in our species, and we're doing okay, we're not doing as well as we could, but we're doing okay with this as a species from the last, many, many tens of thousands of years, is that we find a way to find things for those older people to do. They support us, they help us manage our offspring, they support our economy, they give us other kinds of things that are supportive that way, and we learn how to stay healthier and keep those family influencers with us longer than they might have originally been designed for. So yeah, natural selection is not choosing every single aspect of your life. Natural selection is just really working on those things that make you be able to be survivable and reproducing while you're really, really young. Okay, so let me turn this on for this one. Okay. Alrighty, so does anybody have any last questions here? Anything that you're not sure what you should do? So again, we will meet in the morning to set up so that you'll know just what to do when you start reading 3, what you're going to need, and a kind of a best case scenario of what to do with the materials. And then I'll wrap that up. And then for the second half of your scheduled class time, I'll open up the portal so you can log in to exam 1. You're going to see just 25 questions. Most of you, it's not going to take 25 minutes if you're prepped and you have your stuff ready to go. So be sure on Wednesday when I see you that you have whatever, materials, and you've finished looking over things. If you have some questions about this, which you probably really wouldn't because we've been doing it over and over again for a few days here, but in case you do, I'm happy to answer them, but then we'll just wrap that up. But you'll have what you need in order to make it so that you're not wondering, because chapter 3 is way different with working with it than what we've done so far, but it's doable. Everything is totally doable, just as long as we know we have a roadmap before we start with what we have to do. So I sent everybody who hadn't logged into quiz 1 yet a reminder, but it will close out at the end of the day today. And again, it'll have you practice some of the ideas from chapter 2, but there is also questions from 1 and from the other materials that are on. Okay. So thank you for any or all of you that post onto the discussion board on better tips on how to get into Zoom when it won't let us in from its own procedures. And I'll be carrying that forward, and I will see you on Wednesday then. Thanks you all.